typically any study will show you this, women take longer to think about applying for jobs. They're gonna question themselves, am I really just the right person for the job? Am I not too small? Am I skilled enough, et cetera, et cetera? And so they take longer. So what we're doing is, on the one hand, on a recruiting standpoint, we're actually lengthening the time for sourcing before we actually post the job.
I'm going to do a fireside chat in a moment with Anouk, of course from Uber, as you know. But in the meantime, before we start that, Anouk's going to give a little bit of a talk about the past and the present, and then we're going to have a fireside chat about the present and the future. So, without further ado, please, a big round of applause for Anouk.
Hello. Super happy to be here. If there's one thing that I take away from all of the sessions that I've actually been to earlier today and yesterday is there's a lot of buzzwords going on in the organization. We hear a lot about transformation. We hear a lot about agility, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Uber, which has now become kind of a common word, is also probably one of those buzzwords as well. So what's happened at Uber is basically going to be what I'm going to be talking about. But if there's one thing that I'd love for you all to also take away from the session is, obviously we've been on a journey, we're still on a journey, and there's lots of things that we have done to fix some of the things that we need to fix in the past, but not everything's perfect, and we still have lots of things that we need to work on. So first of all, maybe a bit of a personal anecdote. I was working at Booking.com prior to joining Uber. And late 2016, I get a call from one of the executive recruiter guys at Uber. And first call, I thought, what the heck is this? I had a pretty negative perception of Uber from the outside, and that was before all of the events that a lot of you will have heard about and read about. But I thought Uber is a tiny company to start with. It was just somewhere around 6,000, 7,000 people, I think, when they called me. And I thought it was a bunch of arrogant kids working in the organization. I went into the process. I had, I don't know how many different conversations. I'll probably get to this later, but I actually really got intrigued further and further and really motivated by all of the conversations that I had. I actually really changed my perspectives on the organization. The funny thing, if that's a funny thing, is the day I actually got the contract in my hands to be recruited and start at Uber is the day that the Susan Fowler blog actually came out. So that was February 2017. For those of you that don't know the story, this is a female engineer back in San Francisco that actually wrote a blog to talk about how toxic she felt the culture of the company actually was at the time. And I got a call from the CHRO, please don't panic, join us, join us, join us. And I was like, I don't panic at all. Like, if there's one place as an HR professional, which I feel I can have a very tangible impact and feel it and see it, this is probably where I actually can do this. So I happily joined in May 2017, but that was really the middle of, kind of, and the beginning of, let's call it what it was. It was a real acute crisis that the company was going through. We were every day in the press for all of the reasons that you all will know. We were constantly attacked from the outside. Everything you would hear about the company at the time was about how bad we were, how toxic our culture was, how bad leadership was at the time. And we had to fix a lot of those things. So we're talking a lot about culture transformation. It was not a culture transformation. It was a culture reboot. We had to literally just go back to the basics and look at who we were, what went wrong in our organization, and how we are going to be fixing it. So we did a lot of things, but there's a lot of things that were wrong, and that's true. Not everything was wrong, but a lot of things were wrong. We had lots of issues with leadership. At the very top, lower in the organization, we had literally no development opportunities or support opportunities for any managers in the organization. There was nothing, no programs, nothing. there was also no space for employees to speak up. We didn't have employee relations programs, for instance. We didn't have anonymous lines, emails, or et cetera that employees could go to. So how could they even speak up or voice what was actually happening in the organization? We had barely any HR team. Most of what we were doing was recruiting people. That's what the HR department at Uber was doing for many years, ramping up the organization. I mean, just for the numbers, and I'm just talking about my tenure 2.5 years ago when we were just 6,000 people, we're 27,000 people today. So, I mean, just imagine the amount of work that just happens in HR just to ramp up basically this organization is a lot of what we're doing, et cetera, et cetera. And we had lots of issues with we talked a lot about this today, about our cultural values. We had 14 of them, and a lot of them, which were probably the right ones at the very beginning of the company when we were still a few hundreds, let's say, resonated, they could be explained, people related to them. Again, fast forward, thousands of employees later, meritocracy, toe-stepping. How can that be understood by so many different nationalities all across the world, et cetera, when you actually can't even explain what it is? So a lot of things just basically drove us to what happened to us as an organization. And so we had to work really, really hard to try and understand how the hell we were going to be fixing this. And so we did lots of things. We revamped our cultural values. We call them norms because we see them as evolving in time and not something that we want to write on the walls or get stuck forever, but something we actually want to have evolve with us as an organization. We've completely revamped performance management as a process and a philosophy. And we did this, both the cultural piece and the performance management piece, not because we felt it was things that we needed to change, but because our employees told us this is what needed to change. And they also told us how we needed to change that. So we designed all of this with them. We got rid of ratings. We heard a lot about this in the last 2 days. We got rid of forced distribution curves, et cetera, et cetera. Not because we felt that was the new trend or something we needed to do, but because our employees told us, we don't like it, it's unfair, it's not objective, it's not transparent, we don't understand it, you guys need to go fix it, and we're going to tell you how we feel that should actually happen. And obviously, in parallel to all of this, we ramped up the HR team. I'm not going to give you the numbers, but we have a proper HR team in place now with all the different standard, I would say, functions that you can think about, again, which we didn't have in the past. So that's kind of the past and where we came from and all of the focus. If I look at where we are today as an organization, again, not everything's perfect, but we're working really, really hard to fix a lot of things still and to continue to evolve our organization. And obviously, we've gone through IPO in the last few months. That's shifted a lot of the focus that we have as an organization. We're talking a lot about words that weren't really sexy for us in our organization, for a lot of people that joined us to start with, very entrepreneurial, et cetera. Talk about efficiency. Ooh, that's like a scary word for many, many, many people. For us, it's a necessity. We've grown so fast, so rapidly, et cetera, to the extent that we know, yeah, we didn't really think about org structure, org health. Do we have the right people in the right roles, where they need to be, et cetera, et cetera. And so obviously, we need to focus on that. And there's two big pieces of work that we have been working really heavily on and we still work on, which are diversity on the one end, and let's say development on the other. From a diversity perspective, it was a necessity because we, again, with all of the cultural challenges that we've gone through, we needed to look into how can we really make sure that we become one of the most and diverse and inclusive places on the planet. And not because, again, it's a trendy thing to do or that we have to do it, but because we know it's the right thing to do. So we did lots of different initiatives, and we're still in the middle of some of that. First pieces of initiatives that we've gone through was around raising awareness in our organization. We talked a bit about this in the last few sessions. How do we make sure that, and leadership, and any sort of employee, regardless their function, their role, their level, et cetera, is absolutely aware of their own unconscious biases. We all have some. We all grew up in different cultures, different environments. We all have different ways of looking at things. And that obviously impacts the way that we're going after interviews, for instance, even when we do peer interviews, how we actually interact with our colleagues, et cetera. So we trained a lot of people in our organization. Over 5,000 people yet to date have been trained on diversity and again, unconscious biases, etc., and cultural awareness, trained our leaders, and trained our hiring managers in interview. How do you make sure that unconscious biases don't creep into the interview processes, etc.? So again, a theme around awareness, a theme around inclusion. How do we make sure that we create, again, and I loved what Charles from PMI actually said yesterday on stage around, it's more about the I than the D, and that's very similar to, I think, how we look at things at Uber in general. It's much more about that. So how do you create an environment where people can speak up, be represented, et cetera, et cetera. So we have very strong employee resource groups. At Uber, we have 12 of them. 1/3 of our entire employee population actually sits in them, either as very active employees representing each of their different groups, or as allies, but again, are very, very motivated and very active in those groups. So that's a very strong thing. The other thing we've done is we want to know who actually works at Uber. And it sounds maybe as a very straightforward question, but it's not straightforward. You will know this as HR professionals, but in a lot of countries, legislation doesn't allow you to probe further than eventually gender. And so how do you know who are the people of your organization? What we've done is we've launched a self-ID campaign where people can self-identify. And we've got a large population at Uber who's actually taken that survey. And so we know, and we can do some sort of cross intersection between different things, such as disability, such as sexual orientation, such as gender identity, not just the gender itself, but how do I identify it as an individual, etc. Caregiving status, and I'm not going to name all of them, but we are able to actually know who are the people that work for us. And what's helped us do is really think about what are all of the benefits. We talked about some of this, I think, in the previous session as well, but we want to do this very tailored to who actually work for us in our organization. So that's more around creating inclusive workplace. The third piece that we've done is around obviously moving the dial. So we've done lots of things on a recruitment standpoint and on a sponsorship standpoint. We know that women, typically any study will show you this, women take longer to think about applying for jobs. They're going to question themselves. Am I really just the right person for the job? Am I not too small? Am I skilled enough, et cetera, et cetera? And so they take longer. So what we're doing is, on the one hand, on a recruiting standpoint, we're actually lengthening the time for sourcing before we actually post a job. So that leaves actually much more time for women to get into the upper funnel of the recruiting process, so that when we kick off the recruiting process, we actually, by definition, have more women into the process. We've looked into having and making sure that we had at least one female candidate, for instance, especially for managerial position, because that's where it's most acute in any organization. I'm sure it's the same, in the final stages of the recruiting process. And so by doing this just on a recruiting standpoint, we've actually managed to hire at parity today, 50-50 across the genders, across all levels in the organization, which is a pretty satisfying achievement, and we're pretty proud of that. So that's what we've done on the diversity side. On the development side, lots of different programs, not going necessarily into all of the details, but we're doubling down. We're making sure our managers, we can give them back some responsibility and they can take ownership. They're being trained properly. We're looking at all sort of mobility programs. We move people so much at Uber across different geographies, different roles, different businesses, and et cetera. Thousands of employees move per year in our organization because we really believe that that's the best way to actually retain our talent, giving them opportunities within the organization. So that's basically been and the journey so far and the focus today, and mainly on those two themes, again, around diversity and development.
We're going to switch to a fireside and then a Q&A, but first of all, an applause for Anouk inspiring us. I mean, what I loved about Anouk just then, and hopefully now for the next 10, 15 minutes, is the fact that it's very concrete. Right? We hear a lot of theory and inspiration at these events. I think I could listen to you for 2 hours. These people could on all the things that you're doing and have done. So thank you. First question, though, for me is you've solved some, or you're solving some of the bigger stuff. What's next? What's the next big challenge?
Well, I guess we've got two, probably more than this, but two that come to mind, I'd say. One is, again, we're 27,000 people today, which is kind of, it's becoming a large organization, you would say. We still like to think ourselves as a startup. And by the way, within our startup, we have startups. So we have the more mature businesses like our car sharing business, our Eats business, et cetera, which are probably the most mature pieces of our organization. But then we've got all of the other businesses that we are launching. We have Jump, bike, scooters, et cetera. We've got Freight that just kicked off here in EMEA, and many more. And so how do you look at becoming more mature as an organization? We need to. Again, I talked about IPO, bringing some efficiencies in the organization. And you need to do this, but at the same time, you need to safeguard some entrepreneurship and real startup DNA in those new businesses to make sure that they ramp up at the same pace as we've managed to do for the other businesses that are more mature today. So just finding this right balance is something that we're focused on, and for sure one challenge that we've got today and certainly ahead of us. The other challenge, and I've loved some of the sessions that I've attended today that actually talked about this, which I don't know, and I think we haven't actually cracked well enough today. You often will hear about Uber as an organization, again, with a pretty negative lens from the outside, and thank goodness less and less and less and less, and nearly no more today. But often it's from a negative lens in the market. We're not really doing a good enough job at just working on our reputation. And whilst we've done all of the things and many more that I obviously won't have time to name today, how many people actually know about some of the things that we do? How proud can we start being again? Because we weren't, just to be clear, 2.5 years ago we weren't. We weren't going outside, we were just keeping things to ourselves. Never we would talk to a conference, never would talk to journalists about things that we were doing, because we weren't proud. So we are today. So how do we just go outside and try to influence the culture, not just from within, but also from the outside in, and really make sure that we focus on our reputation?
Okay. Coming to a practical tip then, especially the first part, the startup within the startup parts. What's the most practical tip you can give for other people facing into having a startup within a larger company?
Yeah, bureaucracy and ownership on that. So we really believe that we are a very decentralized organization in terms of like decision power in general. So if any one of our employees actually feel very strongly about a process that's actually not necessary, or other organizations do that. It's not something that's just true to us, but that it's very strong at Uber in general. Just make sure you raise your hand. Like, is that really something that we need to have? And if it's not a policy you really need to have, or if it's not a process you really need to have, you probably just kill it.
I mean, I've been working recently with a lot of startups and a lot of multinationals. And the multinationals want to be more startup-like, and the startups want to be more multinational-like in terms of how they do things. Yeah. Do you have any wisdom on the rights and wrongs of that?
I mean, I don't know if I have a wisdom on that, but I think again, it's just striking this right balance between you need to be more mature, and again, you're going to have different reasons for that to be. For us, again, we're post-IPO, we've got our investors at our back, obviously our stock price is what it is, and there's lots of eyes on it, and et cetera. So we need to be much more focused on efficiencies and cost controls and et cetera. And at the same time, we grew as successfully as we have because we've let our businesses do a little bit what they needed to do to actually grow that fast. And sometimes some decisions are not logical. Sometimes you're going to have duplication of work, and that's okay, and that's what you need for those businesses to grow, for instance, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you manage that balance, and how do you create an environment where actually both can coexist?
Good, thank you. So I would like to open it up to some Q&A from the audience.
Thank you. This is very inspirational. We're talking about the balancing, about being a startup or a grown company, and I would like to know your take on leadership of that. How can we enable our leaders to be comfortable with dealing with the paradoxical nature of organizations nowadays, if you're doing something in that direction on leadership development specifically?
Yeah, so on leadership, for us, it's been also that duality. We've got very young, very capable, very ambitious, and very smart leaders, but they're very young. So how do we actually make sure, but they've also built the company. So we need that talent. So how do you also make sure that you balance keeping that leadership in different positions, and you might just shift things around, but how do you make sure that you keep the young talent within and continue to grow them versus actually hiring from the outside at the level that you actually know you will need, especially in the next, let's say, 5 years. And managing that balance and also making this a very cohesive leadership team is obviously a very big challenge. So a lot of the focus, and I'm not sure it very precisely answers your question, but just to tell you some of the challenges that we have and the focus, one of the things that we're doing is obviously upskilling managers, leaders, etc., in many different ways. And again, I don't think it's rocket science. There's a lot of, let's say, pretty standard leadership programs in general. We think they're really cool, but I think it's pretty standard leadership programs. Maybe the one thing that we're doing more so than other organizations is team dynamics in general. So how do we bring teams together? Because we have those differences of sometimes age, typically, and generations, and etc. Different ways of looking at the world from the outside in, or from the talent that's grown from within. And how do you actually make this work together, that they don't walk on each other's feet and they can together really bring this organization forward? So that's typically one of the things that we focus on.
Next question? Here, I'll take it. I'll throw it. Thank you. Are we going?
C'est là-dedans. Okay. I am a local. Anouk, I just want to ask you a question. Max talked about what big companies can learn from startup and reverse. One issue with Uber, and we discussed during lunches, together, is the issue of being proud of a company. Or when you are talking to colleagues and you are obviously working for Uber, you may have some very negative reactions, because people are, So what you have done in 2 years, if I understand, you have real proudness. I want to ask you, did you learn something from the very old company, century-old company that have been very proud for, I'm taking a French example like Michelin, if you want Michelin tire, where the people are staying a long time, they are very proud of that company and very successful. So what can you learn from old century or several old century companies?
I think, we're just a few years old when you actually consider, so I think we need to see if we actually can keep this pride in time. One of the things that I'll say personally is, again, back to when I was hired at Uber, I remember the conversation I had at the time, which were, when I signed, finally, which was like, are you crazy to join such an organization? Like literally friends, families, and etc. Like, are you nuts? Like, don't you actually read the press? And one of the things that really struck me throughout my tenure, and still today, you're still going to have people from, being candidates in the process and et cetera, that go into this process and have questions from their families and friends on, really, you're joining Uber? And so we still, to my point earlier, we still need to fix something around and reputation, how we talk about it, et cetera. The really good thing that we have is that once people are in, they discover a world that they definitely don't see from the outside. And even myself, honestly, when I went through the process, again, very skeptical about the company and et cetera, I went in, I barely knew the product. I thought it was a cool product, moving people from A to B. And then I came to the office, and if you ever walk into an Uber office, you will see this. We have stuff, for instance, in the screens on our meeting rooms, and it's actually stories from drivers on how just driving on our platform has actually changed their lives. And it's real quotes from drivers. We do lots of listening sessions with our drivers and et cetera. And I was not aware of this. Just something I just didn't even think about. The impact we can have on, obviously, people's lives in general because they choose to drive on our platform, or urbanism, cities in general, et cetera, et cetera. And so, again, this pride that you have as an employee of Uber today, working for this organization, with the impact this company actually can have, again, on all of those things that I've named, is, I think, beautiful, but something that I don't think we're good at taking outside and actually talk about. So we need to do better at that. And certainly we need to learn from other organizations also how they go about going out to talk about it. Because the pride within, we have that.
You can try. Last question, I'm afraid, for now.
Hi, Anouk. Uber's known for its use of technology, and the app is fantastic. Are you using technologies and people analytics much in HR?
Yes. So we are a very, very data-driven organization, and that spans across all of the different functions within our organization. I was actually really surprised when I came in, and I thought, given the size of the organization, probably the systems are not great, data access is not great, and et cetera. And I found an organization that was actually really advanced on being able to do predictive analytics and et cetera, which really surprised me. And so we have very solid systems in place, and therefore being able to pull data from those systems, but also being able to cross data, check with different variables and et cetera are things that we do on a daily basis. So it's actually really good. Yeah.
Good.